From the Mutual Broadcasting System, this is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome back to STRAT. We're going to have some distinct strategic risk assessment talk. And what's interesting is this week, of course, this last week, this month, or this last month, there's been so much that's happened. And I'm going to try and touch on a number of different things. I'm going to start talking about Russia, though. And now I've been on the news talking about Russia, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine constantly. But I'm going to touch on something that showed up in a couple of different articles fairly recently. One was in Fortune magazine, and it was basically taken from an article that was in Foreign Affairs. And I'm kind of want to hit on what they're talking about there, and it's the essential strategic problem, if you will, that Russia has, that Putin has in particular. Putin, like all autocrats, like all dictators, their primary purpose in life is to stay in power. That's what they want to do. If you look at their actions, their goals, sometimes we look back, we go, why would you have ever done that? Well, the reason they did that was because they were looking at their personal survival in power more than anything else. And they will make mistakes on the international stage, globally speaking, but it's really all about them. And that's kind of what Putin's looking at is, all right, so, he kicked off this war in Ukraine, in the February of 22, and he thought he was going to swoop down, and for the most part, most of the war would have been over within a few weeks. It would have been a mopping up action around the rest of Ukraine as Kyiv fell and all the major cities fell, and that did not happen. The Ukrainians were outgunned, outmanned, and they outwitted their Russian opponents left and right. And they fought them to a standstill. Eventually, Russians had to withdraw far away from Kyiv because they simply just couldn't sustain those lines. And it's been a slog ever since dealing with the Russians. But the Russians have a problem. And the reason I write this is, of course, we had the election here in the U.S. Donald Trump won a second term, not a consecutive second term, but he won a second term. And during his campaign, and certainly everything he's talked about, he wants to see, his first day in office, he would end the war in Ukraine. And there's certainly been a lot of discussion about, can he actually do that? Would Ukraine agree to it? Would the Europeans agree to it? Most importantly, would Putin agree to it? And of course, if none of those parties agree to it, you can say all you want, but you're not going to end the war in Ukraine because there's just no way the U.S. can impose its will like that to stop that. The U.S. can cut off aid, it can do a lot of other things, but it can't literally force the parties to come to some sort of peace agreement or armistice or even a ceasefire simply by saying it's going to happen. It can help work those issues, it can present proposals. But a lot of things have happened. But I want to get back to the fundamentals on what Ukraine faces and what came out of this article in Fortune by Jason Ma. And I'll talk about where he got some of this stuff. But in this, he talks about Russia's war economy. And that's what's often missed. And I'm going to get into Russia's economy here. This is not the first time I've said this. I've been saying this continuously about Russia. It's the old saying about statistics never lie and liars always use statistics or something like that. The statistics that come out of Russia are very self-serving. And the Russian government, and if you want to go back, the Soviet government used to put out these statistics that just did not look right. They didn't make sense. And that's kind of what we're seeing now is a lot of the stuff gets repeated. There's a lot of naysayers on, Ukraine can't possibly keep up this war and everything. And they will point to the Russian statistics saying, look at Russia's economy is doing great. It's growing. It's defying expectations. It's much more resilient than most people thought. and trying to say that the sanction regime isn't working. Well, that's exactly, those are all Russian talking points, by the way, and they're repeating them. What he talks about is that Russia's war economy is really on its last legs. And the conundrum for Vladimir Putin is that ending the war, peace, if you want to say that, could even be worse for Vladimir Putin than trying to maintain what is truly an unsustainable war effort. And he is in a real bind, through a proverbial rock and a hard place. And I think that's something that everyone needs to kind of understand. He noted that a lot of the reports on statistics are notoriously unreliable, as I just mentioned. Of course, he cited the article I talked about as well. One of the things to go back historically is to look at Khrushchev, back in the 50s and 60s, banging his shoe on the dais at the UN, saying, "We will bury you." Basically, Khrushchev's entire mantra was that this command economy, all right, if you will, that this centralized planning, these 5-year plans of the Soviet Union, were so good at marshaling resources, putting resources and investment where it needs to go to create the greatest public good, that eventually that the USSR's per capita income would dwarf the U.S. sometime in the 70s. That it was catching up quickly, and that this was the model. This was the economic model of the future, which was communism. All right. Well, that didn't happen. In fact, by the late 60s, early 70s, it was becoming clear that the wheels were starting to come off the Soviet vehicle, if you will, the Soviet truck. That it was having all sorts of huge diseconomies, horrible investments that did not make any economic sense. And that when you got into the statistics, and by the way, Soviet statistics always showed their economy growing great, even when their economy was downsliding in the 80s. Their government statistics were always basically a pack of lies, essentially, to cover up just how bad things were, that the actual opposite was occurring. That they were cherry picking certain things to make it look like that and extrapolating out and covering up the vast diseconomies that they didn't want to measure. Essentially saying the statistics, just like in Khrushchev, the statistics that Putin is quoting now are largely conjured up to make the economy look like it's doing better. That they're cherry picking certain things and extrapolating or exaggerating what they are, and that they're effectively wrong. There are estimates out there that Russia's got a 3.9% GDP growth, gross domestic product growth. That is a very impressive number. That puts it amongst the nations of that size. It puts it amongst the top around the world. And obviously, that's something that a lot of people writing about the Russo-Ukraine war point to and say, oh, the sanctions have failed. However, based on what? They're basically picking the source data is the Russian official source data, and it's effectively wrong. And actually, this fundamental failure of using accurate data, it makes it look like Russia can sustain the war indefinitely, when in fact it can't. Assessments are showing many assessments are actually showing the Russian economy is shrinking, not growing at all. Certainly not amongst the best growing economies in the world, but it's actually shrinking. And what you don't see is you see certain dominant industries, the large Russian industries, are getting reported, but those smaller companies, mid-level companies, are reporting as basically whatever they want to be, but it's not being accurately assessed in any way, shape, or form. And it's very difficult to assess that from the outside as well. Russian defense spending is now a third of its budget, and this is seen as largely unsustainable. They are literally taking money away from paying for wounded veterans, disabled veterans, to pay for their war effort, to give you an idea of. And that's just an indicator, but it's an interesting indicator to show you how tough that is. By the way, that's not a very sustainable indicator for a military. If you're seeing veterans coming back who have been wounded or disabled in the war, and then you're seeing them not able to sustain themselves, basically that the Russian government will not take care of you if you are injured or whatever in the war, well, that's going to hurt the recruitment. That's going to, you're going to see a lot more people trying to evade conscription altogether. So that has second, third order effects. Some of the key Russian war statistics are truly remarkable. For example, artillery and tanks both have something in common. They use cannons, all right? They have barrels, the cannons that they use. Now, Russia right now in the war is losing about 320 tank and artillery cannons. I'm going to lump those two together, and that's another way of saying they're losing tanks and artillery pieces as well. They're losing about 320 of those a month. Their factories in Russia can only produce about 20 cannons per month. They're relying on pulling these cannons out of old war stocks. I mean, some of this stuff literally goes back to the 60s, 50s. I'm waiting for them to start pulling out T-34 tanks from World War II out of the museums. And they're going to run out of World War stocks. In fact, it's seen that basically they're going to run out of the capability to do anything like this sometime during the latter half of 2025. So they've basically they're scraping the bottom of the barrel right now. And this is something that they can't keep up. This is why it's for Putin, it's so important to get these North Korean war stocks. And some of those are that's old equipment. But it's so important for them to get that because they have no other source for this stuff. China has been certainly supporting Russia throughout this war. They've been doing a lot of stuff surreptitiously, trying to get around the sanctions and everything else. North Korea is not even hiding it. They've just been sending troops and armaments and ammunition as fast as they can over to Russia. And that's why it's so important for Russia to maintain that supply line. But even North Korea does. It's not a bottomless barrel of armaments and stuff. At some point, the North Koreans start to run out as well. Also, Russia's losing about 155 infantry fighting vehicles per month. That's a phenomenal loss rate. They can only produce about 17 of these infantry fighting vehicles per month. And then if you look at the supply and demand issue of artillery shells and troops, across the board, it's unsustainable. When you're pulling troops from your strategic forces, the folks that do ballistic missiles and bombers and stuff like that, and you're putting them as line infantry, very poorly trained line infantry in Ukraine, that tells you have an unsustainable situation. That's what's been going on. And that's one of the reasons they rely on the North Koreans so much, because they're basically desperate for anything. Jason Ma, throughout his article in Fortune, talks about, he's citing basically a foreign policy article by Mark DeVore of St. Andrews School of International Relations. St. Andrews, fantastic school. I know people who've graduated from there. It's just one of the top schools in the world. Certainly in terrorism, it's always one of the top, very top school. And then also Alexander Marin's a professor of finance at the National University of Kyiv and the Moila economy over in Ukraine. They talk about that the war has distorted the Russian economy by favoring large defense firms. And what it's done is it has left small to medium-sized firms that serve the civilian sector at a distinct disadvantage, a distinct lack of capital. You got 21% base rate of borrowing money. They say they have a inflation rate of maybe 6% or something like that, but the inflation rate is really seen as maybe 8%. I've also heard it up to 8.9%. The actual inflation rate in Russia may be closer to 16 to 17%. It's literally double what the official rate is. And you can see that because their version of the Fed wouldn't be setting its rate at 21% if the inflation rate was sitting at 8%. That just wouldn't make any sense. But that's what's going on there. And that really hurts small to medium-sized firms. It's also hurting big firms as well. These smaller firms are going to see a huge burden. They're seeing a burden right now because they can't get enough workers or trained workers or good workers to come in to do what needs to be done. But they're going to see a huge burden if the war is over, because you're going to see this flood of soldiers that come back to Russia. You're going to see all these defense workers, if they shrink the defense industry, the industrial base, that will be flooding the society, and there's no way they can absorb that. Historically, and this is true in Russia as well, historically, societies that experience what they say, quote, hordes of demobilized soldiers and jobless defense workers are a recipe for political instability. And I think with Russia's sort of command-centric economy, to see all this come back, and by the way, I imagine those demobilized soldiers are going to have some very dim views of the Russian state, of the Putin regime, and elsewhere. And of course, they're soldiers. They've been trained. They've been in combat. You know, if they've survived, they've certainly developed some tactical skills and things like that. They could be a very destabilizing element in whatever that Russia will look like. In short, Putin can't afford to sustain the war. He can't keep this up. He doesn't have the defense industrial base. The economy cannot afford to do this. The economy is shrinking. At some point, that's going to catch up. He's in a horrible situation. However, it's not clear they can sustain to keep things going if he doesn't have this. And in the Foreign Policy article explains that Putin is really now down to three options. And I have to tell you, when I saw this, I'm like, that sounds about right. And that, you know, if you really get into the baseline reality of where he is, where the economy is, that really gets down to three big options he's got. First, war's over. He can shrink the military, shrink the defense industrial base. All right. Put all those soldiers, all those troops, all those defense industry jobs, those workers out of work. One of the things this will do, because of the way the economy is currently structured, it will spark a recession, and that recession would inevitably threaten the regime. If you go back to the end of the Soviet Union, it was the economy. You know, more than anything else, certainly a loss of confidence in the Soviet government over, you know, over a major earthquake, and of course Chernobyl, where nobody really believed what the government was telling them, but the economy was on its last legs. The second option would be to try and maintain a massive military, but that would eventually choke off economic growth throughout Russia, and he'd be back into that same desperate economic situation. The third choice, which is kind of a variation of the second one, but the third one is to maintain the military. All right, you know, keep it big. I don't know how he's going to do that, but keep it big. Then use it to seize the resources that it needs to sustain itself. Essentially, it's going back to the ancient concept of warfare, which is the military exists for conquest, and the conquest brings wealth and riches to the, you know, if you want to say the Romans, to Rome. You know, the conquest brings all this stuff to Rome, and that this and conquest and the implied threat of conquest will pay for the military. It's a rather interesting idea. I don't know how that would actually be sustained within a Russian system. And there's a lot of stuff there where I look at it from a military perspective, and I say I just don't think they have the ability to do that. But one of the things that was cited was exploiting gas and oil reserves in the Black Sea. Now, if you look in the Black Sea, there are reserves, huge potential. There are actual and potential reserves of gas and oil. Interestingly, where they sit is in the exclusive economic zone, primarily the exclusive economic zone of Ukraine. Now, some of these things sit off the coast of Crimea, and a lot of these areas they're Ukrainian EEZs, but they are based on land that's currently controlled by Russian forces. And I think everyone can kind of imply what this means. The question is, how could Russia go out there and do that? One of the little things that almost missed everyone's notice was, as Ukraine was doing its counteroffensive, one of the things it did was it was taking gas and oil platforms in the Black Sea. That was one of their things that they were actually focusing on. And of course, their use of unmanned surface vessels, flying, you know, kamikaze drones, if you will, and missiles and everything else, have basically driven the Russians' vaunted Black Sea fleet pretty much out of the Black Sea as a whole. So this is a huge. It sounds like so Russia would go in and try to do this, but number one is de jure they don't really control that unless there's some peace agreement that comes in place that says that they own the territorial sovereignty of that land. They don't own that, and then tactically, operationally, I don't see where they own that. They can simply go out there and start doing production like that. So there's a lot of issues that go with this, and part of their thesis is they think that the international sanctions would be lifted. And that again becomes very problematic. I'm not sure that if there was a peace agreement on the ground that necessarily would imply, a demarcation line is established and there's a ceasefire or some sort of armistice. There's nothing, certainly within the Ukrainian constitution, they cannot cede sovereign territory. I don't see a mechanism where Russia is going to pull its forces out of an area for a period of time to allow those provinces or oblasts to conduct a referendum on whether they want to be Russian or Ukrainian. I just don't see that coming about. And all of these things would have to happen to cede the de jure sovereignty of these areas. And then operationally, any Russian attempts to really develop those fields could be met with some, distinct kinetic means by Ukraine. They could use those USVs, if you will, to destroy ships or whatever they do. Currently, Zelensky has put out a talking point proposal, if you will, in an interview with Sky News, where he's talked about maybe opening up the idea of stopping what he calls the hot war, the hot part of the war, along maybe current existing lines. Whereas he was asked a lot about NATO membership, it wasn't clear that, certainly it wasn't clear that NATO would take him on as a member with partial, with sovereign territory of Ukraine being occupied by Russia. But he did talk about NATO providing some sort of military umbrella for securing those lines, which is kind of code for saying NATO would put forces into Ukraine as a trigger force, if you will, along those front lines should Russia ever decide to invade again. So that's a big step, but it is something that he has put out there. And it does bring up a question about the Kursk Oblast, where Ukraine actually controls Russian territory. Would this freezing of the lines mean that they're going to freeze the lines in the Kursk Oblast? One would assume that would be yes. And if they freeze the lines in the Kursk Oblast and there was NATO troops introduced to support Ukraine, would some of those forces be peacekeepers, if you will, peace enforcement forces on Russian territory in support of Ukraine? That's something that they're going to have to negotiate and try and figure out. And then also the issue of not just the ending of the sanctions, which I see as very difficult to do, but also they're going to have to negotiate the EEZ implications of these frozen lines on the ground. Does that extend into the water? And then the issue of all the seized Russian assets overseas. A number of those assets have now become encumbered, at least the profits, for paying for aid. So there's a lot of issues that go with this, a lot of things that have to be discussed with any negotiation there. And for Putin, one of the things I really want to bring out about this is he doesn't have any good options. For Putin, he cannot sustain the war. But politically, it's not clear that he can sustain the peace. And so I would anticipate he's going to try and conjure up a bunch of things in any negotiation, which frankly are going to become major stumbling blocks to any sort of ceasefire, armistice, let alone anything even approaching a peace deal, if you will. And unless he's deluding himself, which I don't rule out by any means, he's going to have huge problems. Now, that's what's going on with this. Obviously, other things in the news. There was a DHL crash of a plane over in Lithuania at Vilnius. That's a airport I flew in and out of earlier this year. A lot of things going on there. Bomb scares in Europe. Drones spotted flying around U.S. air bases in the U.K. Explosion at a weapons manufacturing plant in Wales. Telecommunications cables apparently cut by Chinese ships dragging its anchors intentionally across the Baltic coming from Russian ports. Arson attacks to include Ukrainian-owned businesses in London. There was successful attempts, I should say, to interfere with rail operations in the Czech Republic. Ransomware attacks on the National Health Service in Britain. Television satellites being disrupted and damaged across Europe. A Ukrainian defector that was living under an assumed identity that was killed in Spain, and the assassination attempt on the CEO of Rheinmetall. All of these things may seem rather isolated, but Russia is also doubling down on hybrid warfare. And I just want to point that out. You can look at each one of these things and go, well, it's not purely conclusive. Hey, these are covert operatives. of course they're not going to leave a lot of telltale signs. In some cases, it's pretty clear that it was Russia behind it. The assassination in Spain had all the hallmarks of a Russian, pardon the expression, hit, if you will. And these other things, there's just a certain amount of plausible deniability that go with that. But it's pretty clear that Russia has now amped up the game on hybrid warfare. Both the heads of MI5 and MI6, the British Security Service, the British Overseas Intelligence Service, have both been talking about this hybrid warfare threat from the Russians and all the things that they're doing. And of course, with a focus on the threats to the United Kingdom. But this is a huge issue that Europe is dealing with. And essentially, Russia is basically involved in an undeclared war, if you will, on Russia, on territory throughout Europe. And Europe especially is going to be very reluctant to enter into any deal with Russia until all of these matters are resolved. And I imagine that the European nations, the EU and NATO especially, are going to bring up these Russian hybrid warfare issues as something that has to be worked on. All right. That's a lot of information that I've covered this week. We've talked about a number of things. I'm going to leave Israel, the Middle East, the ceasefire, implications of that for another podcast in the future. Obviously, a ton of stuff going on there. I imagine that things will change very quickly in the coming weeks, but that's a lot to conjure. And if I have one thing I want to say is that for Putin and for the Putin regime, they cannot sustain the war, but they may not be able to sustain the war ending. And that is something that I think everyone has to take home, because that's going to have dramatic implications. It's going to impact not just the war fighting on the ground, but it's going to impact markets. It's going to impact financial markets. And it probably means that Russia is going to rely more and more on this hybrid warfare thing to offset what it's unable to do or what it's unable to influence on the ground in Ukraine. All political campaign discussion aside, the basic economic facts of what Putin is dealing with won't change, right? And nothing I see out there is ever going to fix that. So anyway, we will certainly be talking about this in the future. I want to thank everyone. By the way, I just want to say one thing. We're coming up on Christmas. As you recall, my STRAT co-host, Mark Mansfield, he passed away last Christmas. And I just want to say that, I miss Mark every day, and I just wish he was here able to talk about some of these things that we went through today and certainly in previous podcasts. But it just brings back a lot of memories as we get into the Christmas season here. So anyway, thank you. Thanks for listening.